Go. Cool. Welcome everyone to part 2 of the Getting Your Garden Started class series hosted by Jefferson County Cooperative Extension, Jefferson County Soil and Water Conservation District, and Kentuckiana Backyard Farms. Last week we talked about how to site a garden if you were adding on or starting for the first time. And then we talked about local resources and things that are going on here today. We had a lot of questions and we hope to do that again today. It really kind of be a resource for you all. Today we are going to talk about site prep for new garden sites, and then we're also going to talk about seasonal planting and planning. So glad you all are here. Madeline, Vaughn, and Aaron, do you guys want to introduce yourselves? And Madeline, do you want to share your screen to get started?
Sure. I'm Madeline Marshall. I work for the Soil and Water Conservation District, and really glad to be here with everyone. Just give me 1 second to share.
While she's doing that, I'm Erin. I'm the educator for the Soil and Water Conservation District, and I'm sort of here to answer any questions as I can, but I'm also ready to learn with all of you.
What's up, everybody? I'm Vaughn from Kentuckiana Backyard Farms. I'll be in the chat trying to answer as many questions in the chat or bring up all the questions that are in the chat and bring it to our presenters, Bethany, Madeline, Aaron, and myself. With that being said, let's get the show started.
Okay, can folks see my screen? Right on. So welcome everyone, as Bethany was saying, to part 2 of the Getting Your Garden Started series. We're going to be talking about site preparation. If you're starting for the first time, a bed for the first time from sod, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about raised beds, and we'll touch on container gardening. And also we'll talk about renovating existing spaces if you've already had a garden started for the last couple of years. We'll also talk about how to understand seed packets, how to read seed packets, and everything you need to know from direct seeding to transplanting, all in between, all of that stuff. We'll talk about when to plant what. We will give you some local resources, and our upcoming classes. Next Monday, we have a native plants and pollinators class led by our very own Aaron. And then following that, we'll have a medicinal herbs class, and I will be instructing that one as well. So if either of those sound interesting to you, please join us. Okay, site prep. I'm curious how many of you all, if you want to like say something in the chat, how many of you all are starting gardening for the first time this year? How many of you all have been gardening for a while and are trying to up your skills? How many are just, 1 or 2 seasons in? Share something if you want. We kind of wanted to touch on like the basics, and for those of you who might be starting for the first time, to give you an understanding of how you're going to start from just a patch of lawn and turn it into a magnificent garden. You do want to start by removing the sod or any ground cover or weeds that are covering the earth. You can do that with a spade if you have one. That's the easiest kind of hand tool to use for that. You can also, if you're doing quite a large space, you can rent a sod cutter if you wanted to do like your whole front or backyard. If you have enough people to help you to do that, enough time and energy and person power, then we encourage you to go for it. And renting a sod cutter might be a good way to get a lot of that sod up quickly. There's also some different techniques for establishing new beds, like double digging, which I'll talk about more in a second. and solarization, which Vaughn is going to talk about as well. You can also rent tools like tillers, or even like gas-powered tillers or walk-behind tractors that will help you get the ground nice and loomy and fluffy. Also, if you're doing any kind of raised beds or container gardening, you want to make sure that your vegetables have at least a foot to grow in deep. And for root vegetables, you want to give those up to 2 feet so that they have a lot of space to put down their roots and to grow.
If you don't mind me jumping in right here, Madeline, I'll talk about the pictures on the right-hand side of the screen. Those were from a backyard that I started for somebody. If you see in the first picture, the box had cardboard to lay down over the ground. That is another method that you can use if you don't want to like dig up your grass. You can just cover it, and we basically built the beds on top of the grass using the cardboard as almost like a grass and weed barrier, filled them up, and then planted inside of those beds. And then the other picture where the mouse is over with the straw bales, that was a new method that I found online on Instagram. There's basically you take straw bales and you use that as what would be your raised bed. You sprinkle your compost on top of the straw bale and you water it down, and you plant right inside of the straw bale, which the straw will maintain most of your nutrients and your moisture, and then everything will just grow up out of it. I don't have a picture of what the final product looked like with that one, but that was a really good method and an easy way of basically building beds without having to do a lot of work. And after the season was over, basically you just spread it out and then go right back on top of it with more straw bales.
Awesome.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of great organic sort of like mulch that you can use, like straw or regular mulch, or even like cuttings from larger grasses. And all of that kind of stuff will help once you've dug up your beds, will kind of help to retain that moisture and the nutrients, and also to prevent weeds. So like personally for my gardens, I just like to pile mulch on, you know, all the time. I just keep like a good 3 or 4 inches of mulch on top, and that really helps to tamper a lot of the weeds. Some fun tools too. Broad forks are really great if you are just wanting to sort of break up the soil of already existing beds or beds that you've already created. They're really great tools. The rule of thumb for compost is you want to add about 30% to your beds as you're creating new ones, or even breaking into ones from previous years. And then always nice to use like the back of a rake to shape your beds if you're making new beds, or again, if you're revisiting beds that you've already used. I just wanted to touch for a second on double digging, because it's a very easy, a very simple, and a very effective method for starting a new space. So if you follow our diagram here on A, if you dig your first bed or your first trench, sort of, if you're not going to do beds and you just want to do like a nice rectangle or a square of your yard, if you take that area, and you can use string too, like you can do stakes and string to sort of like line out your area if you want to keep it nice and straight. But you can start with the first trench, and you can dig one shovel's depth deep. And then you can put all of that topsoil in a wheelbarrow or in buckets and take it over to the end of your designated area. And then you'll be left with maybe some more topsoil under that, but definitely you'll probably hit the hard pan or a lot of clay at some point. That area can be sort of loosened with a digging fork or a shovel again. So you're going another, 8 to 12 inches down. And that's where we get the name double digging. You're digging down twice into the earth. At that point, once you loosen up all of that soil, this darker area here, you can add compost or any other kind of fertilizer that you might want to use. Then you move to your next trench and you take that topsoil and you put it on the first trench. And then you dig into that one again, into the second trench again, and you add your compost. And then you sort of just do that down the path of your designated area until you get to the end. And the topsoil from the very first trench ends up in the last trench. Any questions on that?
Outside.
Or any questions in
Okay.
general?
Meeting. I have a question on the double digging.
Yeah.
Do you like if you could do this even with like existing lawn and dig that and flip it and would you try to take out the grass or what do you think?
Yeah, so I would take the sod off first of the area, or you could, like Vaughn's going to talk about solarization, you could tarp it first to kill everything. Or you could, yeah, I would remove all of the grass though. You don't kind of want that in your mix, it's just going to add more weeds. But then yeah, you can do this method with any section of your lawn. And I would also recommend to do a soil sample before this too, so that you kind of know what's up. But if that's going to be your space, then hopefully you'll be able to add amendments as you need to. And unless you run into a lot of super heavy clay or anything like that, this really should work for a lot of spaces. Do we have any questions in the chat, Vaughn?
No questions so far.
Cool. You want to take it over?
Got you. So solarization. As you guys can see in these two pictures, this is actually out at Farnsley Mormon. The picture on the left-hand side with the tarps and everything covering the ground. What I'm basically doing here is killing out the weeds, the bacteria, insects, and things of that nature. You want to go somewhere between 2 weeks to 16 weeks, which could be, basically all winter. And you lay down your tarps, preferably something that doesn't allow the sun to penetrate, but just heat it up. Because if it's like clear plastic, all you're doing is like, causing like a greenhouse effect on the ground. You don't want that. But what you want is the ground to basically heat up, cause everything underneath there to basically die, and then nutrients from the plants and whatnot will stay with the soil underneath, which will give you a good product, as you see on the right hand side. And then once you get to the right hand side, you could till, you could burn, add your soil amendments or anything like that to then start your garden. So, and that's it. It's a very, very easy way to smother out, a lot of your problems without having to, rent a tiller or a sod cutter or anything of, that manner.
Vaughn, can you
Is
talk
there any
about
questions?
Go ahead. About burning a little bit for a second?
Gotcha. So after you pull the tarp and you get to the soil, what basically happens after that is you might still have some like seeds or plant that blow into your space, and you'll see them start to pop up because you give it about like a week after you remove the tarps. What you want to do is, get you a propane tank and a torch, and you just walk through and roast all the plants back down to the ground, like want to sear them down to the ground. And at that point, again, you add your compost, start your rows, and start to grow. Does anybody have any questions about, what you see in front of you?
Hey, Vaughn, I have a question about this.
Go ahead.
How do you know how long to do this for?
How do you know how long? Basically, if you start off with green and then you cover it up, you want to go anywhere between 2 to 16 weeks. Why that long and how that long? 2 weeks will be probably when the sun's out and the sun's beating down on the ground, everything's hot and it dies out. You'll know you're good whenever you lift your tarp up and you see that everything's virtually dead, and you could just reach down, grab it, and it'll pull right off the soil, and soil will just drop from it. The dirt will drop from it really, really easy. Outside of that, the 16, like say for instance, 16 weeks, that will be from, the end of November all the way until March.
I see. That was sort of my other question. Like, how do you know when to do it? So I see if you're doing it over the winter.
It depends on how you want to do it. So for me, like I know at the end of the season, for me, I'm just covering the ground because I'm not going back out there with a cover crop or anything like that. I just cover the ground, and I cover the ground with my tarps just to make sure my soil is still good. Nothing blows in. I don't have to do that much work when the season starts, which is roughly around now. If you're about to start now, where it's about to be hot, everything will move a little bit faster for you. So you'll be somewhere within the 2 to 4 week range rather than like 16 weeks.
Awesome. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Cool.
Great. I think we can move on. Bethany, you want to hop in?
Yeah, absolutely. So after you've got your beds prepped and ready to go, no matter what method you pick, and maybe even while you're waiting, it's time to start to think about, particularly with vegetable gardening is the best question in the world, which is, what do you want to eat? And so that's kind of where I always like to think about starting your vegetable garden. There is no point in growing something that you have no intention of eating. So kind of, if you want to start out for the year, just like asking yourself that question of, what do I even want to eat? And then we'll kind of go on from there. If you want to move forward. All right, so after we've got that list of what do we want to eat, the question is, when can it grow? So plants, just like people, have a favorite time of year where they like to grow. And some of those things that maybe are on your list might be things that maybe just don't grow here at all. So maybe pineapple is on your list, or lemon tree or something like that, or a lemon. And those are things that we can't grow outdoors here in Kentucky. So as you're kind of making that list, depending on how broad and exciting you are on that front, know that we live in central Kentucky. We're in zone 6. So what that means is that tells us roughly how many frost-free days we have all year. For our zone, our average last frost date is April 18th. So that means it doesn't get below freezing at night after April 18th on average, right? And then it doesn't get below freezing again until around October 18th. In the fall. So we have a pretty long growing season here in Louisville, which is really exciting because that means we can grow a whole bunch of different things. A lot of that question of what do we plant when comes down to what's specifically on your list. So pictured on this slide are a couple different resources, and we'll be emailing these out to everyone afterwards as well. So the University of Kentucky puts out this great book, Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky. That has some great planting calendars in it, along with a lot of other garden-based things. You can access it online, and there's the link below. We will also be sending the link out to you all. You can also come into the extension office and get a hard copy of this. In addition to that, pictured on your left is a visual planting calendar that kind of breaks things down by common produce that is grown here, our earliest safe planting date, right, which is again depending on what those vegetables specifically like in terms of climate, and then the latest safe planting date. We run into certain plants, right, that like cooler temperatures that really don't do well in the hot heat of the summer. So we always want to be kind of mindful about what's the earliest that something can go in ground, and then when is it the best time to stop planting that in order to ensure that your plant is happy, healthy, and growing. All right, so that's kind of our next step, is kind of finding those resources and figuring out from your list of what you want to eat, when can you plant it. If you want to move forward, please. So the next question, we've got our list. We know when we want to plant it. You just need to think for yourself about seeds or transplants. What this means, right? So that the question here is like, are you putting a seed in the ground, or are you putting a transplant or a baby plant into the ground? A lot of vegetables can kind of fall in either direction. The benefit of doing a transplant or a couple, one, you can speed up those days to maturity because you're already starting with a visible plant. For some things, we actually need to start with a transplant because those plants have such a long growing season that starting from a seed in the ground on that earliest safe planting date does not give them enough time. For other plants, direct seeding is the way to go. Direct seeding means seed in the ground. And that is particularly true for all of our root crops. So like carrots, radishes, beets, things like that. Root crops need to have that consistent soil contact to get that nice big root that we want to eat. The other thing that really falls into that direct seeding absolutely required is our legumes. So green beans, peas, peanuts, those kinds of plants have a special symbiotic relationship with bacteria in your soil. And so the more you transplant them, just the weaker the plant becomes. So direct seeding is really ideal for that. Otherwise, transplanting can be a great way to speed up time on our end. If you are really excited about transplanting and kind of also want that instant gratification of a garden, transplants are the way to go. The downside is sometimes transplants can be a little more expensive if you're purchasing them rather than cultivating them yourselves. But those are all trade-offs that you just kind of have to figure out for yourself. If you are a tomato gardener, I would definitely recommend doing transplants for your tomatoes. Other really long season crops like peppers and eggplants, also best way to go for them is to transplant. Give or take on some of the other ones are broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower. Those are long season crops, but you can put a seed in the ground pretty early for those and still get them going. Good question, Vaughn. How many people are growing tomatoes or have a favorite tomato variety? Because that's probably the most commonly transplanted crop out of everything. So from there, we've got those kind of commonly transplanted crops, and that's where I like to go through my planting list and my planting dates and then kind of think about that seeds or transplants question and start making my garden plan and my map for the year in terms of what I want to grow, when I plan to plant it, and then also knowing for myself, okay, do I need to go buy seeds? Do I need to go buy transplants? And what to do from there. All right, next. If you are buying seeds, which is going to be for a lot of our gardens, the thing you really want to do is to start with quality seeds. So seeds, just like food in the grocery store, packaged food, have an expiration date. So you want to look at the bottom and check out when the seeds were packed for. You're going to have the most success with seeds that were packed for the current year. So packed for 2022 is going to have your highest germination rate. The older the seed is, so the farther away from 2022 that seed was, the less likely your seeds are to germinate. It doesn't mean they won't. It just means that the seeds are old, and so they may not work out quite as well. So first thing to do is just check out that packed for date. Next, if you've bought your seeds, particularly if you've bought them well in advance, we want to keep them in a cool, dry place. If your seed packets get wet or other things, that also decreases the germination rate of your plants. From there, any seeds that you have left over after your planting, you want to store in an airtight container, ideally in the freezer or refrigerator, for a year, maybe 2. But again, the further away you get from that packed for date, just the less likely your seeds are to germinate. All right, next one. All right, really good seed packets have all the information you need for your specific variety of plant. So the list that I showed you previously have these kind of general lists of like when the first planting date is, last planting date. They'll also have other instructions on there, like when to sow outside or when to start indoors, and if that's recommended or not. So a lot of things will have something like the, oops, sorry, just a second. All right. All right, so they'll have instructions on there. So like when to sow outside. So you'll see those will be noted as kind of basing it on our average last frost dates. I saw a couple of notes in there about how have our frost dates changed so much in the last few years. They haven't. So the average is looking at, right, our long range climate and thinking about, you know, when do we generally not have any more frost? A lot of people here use Derby as that planting date, and you'll notice that Derby is about 2 weeks after the average last frost date. So that's a way to be kind of extra safe and secure in there, but you can absolutely plant any of your tender crops in mid-April and they will be fine for the most part, with that caveat of you should always watch the weather and be ready to go outside and cover things if you need to. So again, like knowing our frost dates for where we are is really key to being able to read those packets. So if we're looking at this seed packet, we'll notice that it has a recommended to start inside. And that's because this is a tomato with a really long growing season. So this is a planting this seed, particularly indoors, 4 to 6 weeks before transplanting outdoors. If that's something that you don't feel like you want to do, if you're reading seed packets in a store, for example, that might be your kind of opportunity to say, wow, I really don't have the time or the knowledge or the energy or the space this year to start seeds indoors. So I'm just going to change that on my list to I'll buy a transplant, and that's okay too. All right, next slide. All right, so from there, once we kind of know the when to plant based on the frost dates, we want to check out the back of the seed packet for our planting instructions. So you'll notice they've got some pretty key information on the back that tells us what to do. So one of the first things we will look for is days to emerge or days to germinate. Most things will have a range, like this plant has a days to emerge as 5 to 10 days. If it's not listed, because sometimes it's not, 14 days is a really good rule for most of our vegetables. And that's really good because it kind of helps us know, particularly if we're using older seed, if after 2 weeks, nothing has come up, the seed's no good and it's probably time to replant. And then again, right, it also helps you plan for your garden too. If you've got that 5 to 10 day range, then maybe you can kind of, again, notice like, okay, you know, maybe something went wrong and they didn't emerge, or wow, everything came up in 5 days. I'm doing great and ready to go. The next thing you want to look at is seed spacing. So seed spacing is looking at how to put your seed into the ground. So that'll take that. So how to put something into the ground. In general, it'll tell you like how many, you know, 1/4 inch down, 1/2 inch down. And if you don't see that, then a general rule is to make a hole about 2 times the height of the seed. So you can almost, so for a lot of seeds, that's actually like 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch down, depending on the size of the seed. But that's a good kind of plan if you don't see that on there. Row spacing tells you how far apart your rows should be, right? If you plan on doing more than 1 row of something. And that's basically what that's helping you think about, is how much space those plants need in between each other in order to grow to their full mature height. It's super easy when plants are small to plant things really close together because those seeds are so tiny. But as they get big, right, as the plants get bigger, we want to have a plan for giving them enough space to be their happy adult selves. Which brings us to the last part that's on a seed packet, which is thinning. So thinning is another method of making sure that your plants have enough space to grow without doing all that measuring on the front end. So instructions on this is when your seedlings are 2 inches tall, you want to thin them out until you have one plant every 24 inches. So that's specific to this type of plant. So what that's telling us for these tomatoes is that they need about 2 feet of space in between each plant. You can also do this on the front end if you're reading your thinning instructions by simply measuring and leaving those spaces in between for those seeds. I saw a bunch of stuff come up in the chat while I was talking, so I want to pause and see what questions we have going on before we go forward.
I think it's Jerry. Jerry was asking where he can get tomato seeds that weren't genetically modified.
So one of the things, so on this seed packet, you will notice that there's 2 labels on here that might be helpful for that. So one is no GMOs that you'll see on those specific seed packets. They'll also be on plant labels. Another one is to look for certified organic seeds or plants. All certified organic seeds and plants are non-GMO. It's a part of the organic standards. Lots of places sell both of those things. So for you as a consumer, it's a matter of reading those labels. There's also seed companies that are specifically either organic or non-GMO or both, depending on where you go. So I don't know that if there's like a specific place, but that would be just some things to look for on any and all seeds. Other questions that came up in the chat?
Rebecca just wanted to know, does heirloom mean the same as non-GMO?
So heirloom just means old, older seeds and older variety. Generally, heirlooms are non-GMO, but that is not mutually exclusive. But there is a very, like 99% likelihood that if you have bought a seed that specifically says heirloom, it is also non-GMO. But again, read the instructions. The other thing that you want to look at when you're reading seed packets, 2 is looking for hybrid seeds. You can have hybrids, which are seeds that have been bred to be resistant to certain things. Hybrids do fall into the GMO category, but it may be something, a lot of hybrids that we see are resistant to 1 or 2 types of specific diseases. You see this a lot with tomatoes, with some of their vine wilt things, and that's a choice, right? So you can purchase or grow plants that are hybrids, so they have natural immunity to some common tomato diseases, and it's a trade-off in terms of your time and energy that you may be spending later dealing with those things. So all things to look for, and just to kind of read and look at on your seed packets or tags as well. Are there other questions in the chat? Cool. All right, let's move on. All right, so again, like once you've kind of got your seeds or plants put together, your planting list, go back to those safe spring planting dates and kind of make a look for all of those. Again, your seed packet or the seed tag is going to have a lot more specifics, particularly when it comes to days to maturity for those plants. And that becomes really important as you're planning maybe successions of gardening, because you'll notice some things that can be planted in the spring can also be planted again in the fall. Or maybe you want to try to get a couple different crops in of something in a year. So picking something with shorter days to maturity can be a really great way to go about that. All right, next slide. At this point, we're ready to talk about questions, but we also wanted to share again that we have a class coming up next Monday from 12 to 1 on Zoom about native plants and pollinators. So if you've liked talking about vegetables today, but maybe you also have a plan to incorporate native plants into your garden space, or that's maybe the focus of what you're doing, join us next week to talk about that specifically. And then the following week, we'll talk about medicinal plants as well. And then before we totally go on to questions, 2 more classes talking about animals. So April 4th and then April 8th will be at 2 different places on site here in Louisville, talking about chickens on April 4th and goats on April 8th. Because these are at private locations and we have live animals, we're limiting our class size. So if you're interested, please sign up. That way we can give you an address and also be in touch with you about just some general safety things on that front. And then with that, do we want to just open it up to questions?
Bethany, for those who will need to be bringing their soil samples in, can you remind everybody what the hours are for the extension office?
Yeah, thanks. So if you are interested in doing soil sampling, you can bring your 2 cups of clean soil to 4200 Gardner View Avenue. That's the Jefferson County Extension Office. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. We have a soil station drop off, but if you have questions, you can always knock on the door and say, hey, I have questions or need help filling this out, and we can do that for you. You get 2 free soil samples per year, thanks to the Conservation District. After that, soil samples are $8 each.
The Master Gardeners, there's a question in here about Master Gardeners. I would go to their website and get connected with them directly through their website. There is a form to fill out. I'm doing a project with them right now. They're sort of coming out of COVID times. And so I think that last I checked, when I was doing it, we were getting put on a waiting list. So hopefully they're moving that program forward as soon as we move out of things, but I'll go ahead and connect directly with them on their website.
Barbara is asking what kind of soil do we recommend for planting indoor seeds? My personal favorite is Vermont compost. It's not cheap, but it's incredible. And I think it provides really high germination rates. You can get it at Fresh Start. I think that's the only place in town that sells it. And I also really like Pro Mix, which is a little less expensive. You can get that at Premium Horticulture Supply on Jefferson and also at New Earth, which I forget what street that's on.
Yeah. In general, you can also look for things that say for seed starting, if depending on your price point. So that's another option too. So there's like potting soil, right, that's out there, which is not necessarily does not necessarily have the food needed for baby plants. But if you see something that says like ideal for seed starting or seed starting mix, that's another good clue depending on where you're shopping.
I think the Pro Mix isn't organic. Is that correct? Pretty sure.
I think they might have an organic, they have different types.
Okay.
So there might be an organic type. Yeah.
Thank you. What part of town is Gardner View Avenue?
It is just outside the Waterson between Newburgh and Poplar Level Road. If you know
Oh,
where
yeah.
the main post office is, we're right around the corner.
You keep moving on me. I can't keep track.
We do keep moving.
Let's go, my tiger.
If you are bringing soil samples in, the vouchers are at the table to fill out with your soil. So you can it's a one-stop shop in terms of bringing things in. So there's a form for the soil voucher, and then there's another pretty simple form asking you basically, are you growing vegetables or are you growing other landscape plants or a lawn? So you'll just pick one. And then we ask you if it's a new plant or plant maintenance. And then is your garden in mostly sun or shade? So those are kind of the questions you need to be prepared to answer about your garden space when you bring your soil in. And then hopefully you know things like your name and your address and your phone number and email.
Yeah, Sarah, it gets paid for on the back half. We get how many there were from the extension office and we pay for it. So you don't have to worry about that.
Michael, I see your question about, is there anything you need to do to the ground after spring planting and before tomatoes go in? Not necessarily. I think you can just sort of dig up the soil a little bit, make sure it's nice and fluffy, remove any roots from the things you have planted, and just go for it.
I think your big key there is to not follow crops in the same family one after another, which is pretty easy because tomatoes, so that another way to think about that is if you had a plant where you eat the leaf in the ground, you don't want to follow that planting with another plant that you're eating the leaf off of. So that's probably the easiest way to kind of plan out your garden in terms of succession too, if you're planning on utilizing the same space through multiple seasons. And what that does is, so plants in the same family just tend to eat a lot of the same nutrients or more heavily use them than others. So by doing that really basic crop rotation, you should be good to go. If you're someone who only does a tomato garden in the summer and then only does a tomato garden in the summer, then that's where we want to think about doing compost, more heavy soil amendments in between plantings. But Madeline's totally right. Otherwise, like if you've got peas in there and then you're going to plant tomatoes, fluff your soil and go forth.
Bethany, if we don't have any more questions, I would like to plug one thing that's happening this weekend. There's two things. There's the Jefferson County Soil and Water Conservation District is going to be at the season starts sale at Louisville Gross. I'll be out there doing demonstrations and talking about planting. And then we also have a tree giveaway on March 20th from 2 to 4. We're going to be doing that at Farmington Historic Plantation. We have 4 species, and if you are getting persimmon, I think we're trying to work it out to where you can have more than one tree for that because they need each other. So put those down. It's on our Facebook page, and we only have about 800 trees to give away, which sounds like a lot until it's 3 o'clock and we're halfway through, and then suddenly, you know, they're all gone. So if you want to come out, try to get there as soon as the beginning as possible so you can get your selection of trees that you want. No, not Locust Grove. Historic Farmington Historic Plantation. It's at 3033 Barstown Road, across from where there's like the Rainbow Blossom, and it's by Sullivan. So you just kind of go around. There's a big sign, and it goes back there. We have persimmon, hawthorn, Shumard, red oak, and there's one that I keep forgetting, and I'm really sorry. Let me look.
Buttonbush.
Buttonbush, thank you. That one is in my brain is Buttonbush, right? So, but yeah, we'll have those. And if you are a JCPS teacher and you want to order trees for your students, email me today at educator@jeffcd.org so that we can set some trees aside for you. But that offer is only for teachers. Sorry, gang.
So when you drive up to Farmington and you go early, will your car be the one thing that holds your place in line, or will you get in line? You park your car?
It's just going to depend on the weather, and how Brian, who is their groundskeeper, how it makes the most sense. We don't want to have a ton of cars idling, but because that wouldn't, it's kind of against what we're trying to put in there in the world, right? And we're kind of pretty loose on COVID restrictions now, and so to us it makes sense. It will be a matter of if they have enough volunteers to keep people from going in the historic buildings that aren't supposed to, and kind of how we need to figure that area out. But we do want people to walk the grounds and get familiar, because that's where one of our demonstration spaces is going in. And so I imagine that unless you have maybe some mobility issues and getting out of your car would present a challenge, they do have handicap parking that you're welcome to use, and you can email me and let me know ahead of time, like if that's going to be problematic, and we can make it work for you. We don't want anyone to not get a tree for something that we can solve. So. There's a really great conversation happening in the chat right now about things that eat our babies' sprouts. Can we have this conversation out loud so that we can all benefit from this knowledge? The question was, when Emily, I guess, M. Coleman said, a lot of my direct sown baby plants get eaten, and I assume it's slugs. And then Madeline was offering some raw wool around the base of the stems, prevents the slugs from being able to inch up. And Barb said, it might be some rabbits. So, and Bethany's talking about, if you're not familiar with diatomaceous earth, it's like a tiny little sprinkling of a spell in your garden for when you can't be there all the time. Caterpillar and slug deterrent. So yeah, also, providing habitat for our native birds that'll come and eat those caterpillars for you and feed them to their babies is also beneficial. I don't mind paying the birds and a couple of blueberries, but you can also just protect your blueberries and move ahead that way.
There's also some great screens and nets that are good organic, right? Non-spray, non-product option, like not a product, but still a product, but things that you can put around your plants, whether that the screen is fine enough essentially to keep insects out. Still a little questionable about your ground crawling insects, but it does also work for small mammals. So like chipmunks, rabbits, sometimes squirrels, sometimes birds will even come and pick sprouts out. It's hard to tell when things are really small. So that could be another thing. For a lot of our plants, if it may be mammals, or if that's what you think, or other animals, non-mammal animals, even just some kind of little cage or protective netting until they get to be more mature can be enough to kind of keep those critters out as well.
Beer in a tuna fish can works well for me.
Classic slug trap, absolutely. Yep. And like, yeah. Do you want to describe that a little more?
Yeah, we get empty tuna fish cans, and you go to the store and buy the cheapest beer possible, and just put the beer in the tuna fish cans and just set them around your garden, and the slugs cannot resist it. They will climb in, drink until they die. And I have a cold frame all winter, and that's the only way to keep the slugs out in the wintertime from the lettuce and the spinach is I just keep beer out there in the tins.
Thanks for sharing that one. That's a tried and true trapping method for sure. Other questions that folks have? All right, so it is about 5 till 1. So we will hang out here until noon, just in case anyone else has any last questions that they want to put in. If not, thank you all so much for joining us. If you want to come back next week to talk specifically about native plants and pollinator plants, please join us for that. We're looking forward to seeing more of you then. And then if you have any questions between now and then, or anytime in the future, we'll be following up with an email with some resources that we shared today, as well as contact information for all of us. Thank you all so much for being here.